There are moments in life when everything you thought was solid simply dissolves beneath your feet, when the person you trusted most becomes a stranger wearing a familiar face, when love reveals itself not as sanctuary but as the most elaborate trap you never saw closing around you. And in those moments your brain does something extraordinary. It freezes time while simultaneously racing through every memory you have, searching desperately for the clues you must have missed, the signs that should have warned you that the life you were living was actually a performance, and you were the only one who didn't know it was a show. Maria sat in the oncologist's waiting room that October afternoon, her hands trembling slightly as she held the folder of medical documents, the fluorescent lights casting that particular shade of institutional pallor over everything, making even the cheerful watercolor paintings on the walls seem somehow mournful. And she remembers thinking how strange it was that she could hear her own heartbeat so clearly, each pulse seeming to echo in her chest like footsteps in an empty hallway, and beside her sat Javier, her husband of 12 years, his face a careful mask of brave resignation, the face of a man who had just been told he had stage 3 pancreatic cancer, the face of a man preparing his wife for the impossible journey of watching him die, except that none of it was real. The human brain, you see, is extraordinarily good at believing what it needs to believe, especially when the alternative would shatter the very foundation of your reality. The prefrontal cortex, that beautiful reasoning center of your mind, will actually suppress contradictory information when accepting it would cause too much cognitive dissonance. It's a survival mechanism really, because sometimes the truth is so devastating that your nervous system literally cannot afford to recognize it. Not yet. Not until you've had time to build the psychological scaffolding that will allow you to survive its weight. And so Maria sat there, her amygdala flooding her system with cortisol and adrenaline, her body preparing for grief, while somewhere deep in the unconscious chambers of her intuition, a small voice was whispering that something didn't quite fit, but she couldn't hear it yet, couldn't afford to hear it. Javier had told her about the diagnosis 3 weeks earlier. On a Sunday evening when the autumn light was turning everything golden and melancholy, they had just finished dinner, something simple, pasta with that sauce she always made, and he had taken her hands across the table, his eyes filling with tears that seemed so genuine, so heartbreakingly real, and he said the words that no spouse ever wants to hear. He said he was sick, very sick, that the doctors had found something during a routine checkup, that they had run tests, that the news was bad, worse than bad, and Maria remembers how the room seemed to tilt slightly, how her first instinct was to reach for him, to hold him, to promise him that they would fight this together, that she would be there for every appointment, every treatment, every terrifying moment, and he had held her while she cried, had stroked her hair and told her he was sorry, so sorry to put her through this, and the cruelty of it, the absolute, breathtaking cruelty of it, was that he was performing grief while actually planning his escape. Carmen, a woman I spoke with who went through something similar, told me that what she remembers most is the sensory details, the way her husband's cologne smelled the day he told her his fabricated diagnosis, how the kitchen tiles felt cold under her bare feet, how she could hear the neighbor's wind chimes through the open window. She said these details became almost sacred to her later, not because they were beautiful but because they marked the last moment of her innocence, the last time she lived in the world she thought she knew, and her voice, when she spoke about it, still carried that particular weight of someone who has survived something that shouldn't be survivable, who has walked through fire and somehow found themselves still standing on the other side, changed beyond recognition but standing nonetheless. The thing about elaborate lies, especially lies wrapped in the costume of terminal illness, is that they require an enormous amount of staging. Javier had thought of everything. He showed Maria lab results that looked official, he scheduled appointments at actual medical facilities, he would leave the house wearing comfortable clothes as if preparing for chemotherapy, he would come home looking appropriately exhausted, he even shaved his head gradually, telling Maria the hair loss was beginning. And she would hold him in the bathroom mirror, tears streaming down her face, telling him he was still beautiful, that she loved him, that they would get through this, and all the while he was constructing the perfect exit, using her love and her fear as the tools of his deception. Your nervous system, when confronted with a loved one's suffering, goes into a particular kind of hypervigilance. Your mirror neurons, those remarkable cells that allow us to feel empathy, begin firing constantly. You literally begin to carry their pain in your own body. Maria started having tension headaches, her sleep became fragmented and restless, she lost weight because her stomach was constantly tight with anxiety, her body was responding to a crisis that didn't exist, and this is one of the most insidious aspects of this kind of betrayal. It's not just psychological, it's physiological. Your entire organism reorganizes itself around a false reality, and when the truth finally emerges, you have to heal not just from the betrayal but from the months of unnecessary suffering your body endured. Isabel's story adds another layer to this particular architecture of deception. Her husband had claimed he had a brain tumor, inoperable, aggressive, and for 8 months she had been the perfect caregiver. She had taken family leave from her job, she had reorganized their entire life around his supposed treatment schedule, she had held his hand through what she believed were seizures, had cleaned up after what she thought were medication side effects, and then one afternoon she came home early from the pharmacy and found him in their bedroom, healthy and laughing, on a video call with another woman, and the woman was wearing a negligee, and they were planning a vacation together, discussing flights and hotels as if Isabel simply didn't exist, as if the 8 months of her anguish had been nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed while they planned their real life together. When Isabel confronted him, he didn't even try to maintain the pretense for long. Within minutes the whole elaborate story collapsed, and she said what struck her most was how quickly he shifted from dying husband to annoyed adversary. As if he had simply been wearing a costume and was now relieved to take it off, he told her he wanted a divorce, that he had met someone else, that he needed to move on with his life, and the medical deception, he said with stunning casualness, had seemed like the easiest way to make the separation happen without too much drama, as if manufacturing a terminal illness and putting someone through months of anticipatory grief was somehow less dramatic than simply having an honest conversation. The psychology of someone who would do this, who would weaponize cancer or any terminal illness as a tool for escape, reveals something profound about empathy deficits and narcissistic adaptation. People with certain personality structures, particularly those with narcissistic or antisocial traits, have a fundamentally different relationship with truth and consequences. They can compartmentalize in ways that would be impossible for most people. They can look directly at someone's suffering they themselves have caused, and feel nothing except perhaps a mild annoyance that the other person is being inconvenient with their emotions. Their mirror neurons, those empathy circuits, either don't fire normally or the signals are interpreted differently, as threats to their own agenda rather than as calls for connection. Maria began to notice small inconsistencies around the 6th week, nothing major at first, just tiny fractures in the narrative. Javier claimed he was too nauseous from chemotherapy to eat dinner, but she found takeout containers hidden in his car. He said he had an appointment on a Wednesday, but when she tried to bring him lunch as a surprise, the clinic had no record of him being scheduled that day. Once she answered his phone when he was in the shower and a woman's voice asked for Harvey in a tone of familiar intimacy that made Maria's stomach drop, but each time her intuition raised a flag, her conscious mind would rush to explain it away, the prefrontal cortex working overtime to maintain the coherent narrative, to protect her from the fragmenting truth. This is what trauma specialists call cognitive binding. Your brain becomes so invested in the story you've been told that it will perform remarkable feats of rationalization to keep that story intact. It's not stupidity, it's not weakness, it's actually an adaptive response. Because fragmenting your reality prematurely, before you have the resources to handle it, can be psychologically catastrophic. Your nervous system knows this, so it parcels out doubt in doses you can manage, drip by drip, allowing you to build tolerance to the poison of truth before you have to swallow the full measure. The discovery, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. Maria found a piece of paper that had fallen from Javier's wallet, just a receipt really, from a jewelry store, expensive, a woman's ring, purchased 2 weeks after his supposed diagnosis, and something in her, some buried instinct that had been waiting for permission to surface, suddenly knew, just completely knew, and she sat on the edge of their bed holding that small piece of paper, and she didn't cry, not yet. Instead, she felt an odd sensation of everything falling into place, like the moment in a mystery film when all the clues suddenly align and you can see the whole picture that was there all along. She hired a private investigator, a woman named Sandra who specialized in marital cases, and Sandra found everything in less than a week. Javier had been having an affair for over a year. The woman's name was Veronica, she worked at his company, they had been planning to move in together. The fake cancer had been invented precisely to make Maria the one who would initiate the divorce, to make him the sympathetic figure, the tragic victim that no one could blame for anything. He had even consulted with a divorce attorney before the fake diagnosis, asking specifically about how illness might affect asset division, how to protect himself financially while exiting the marriage. The documentation Sandra compiled was devastating in its thoroughness. Photographs of Javier and Veronica together, clearly healthy, clearly happy, texts between them joking about his performance with Maria, about how convincing he was being, about how much longer they would have to wait before they could be together openly, and in one message, Veronica had written "I can't believe she's falling for it" with a laughing emoji, and Javier had responded "she's always been too trusting, it's actually kind of sad." And Maria told me that reading those messages was somehow worse than discovering the affair itself, because it showed such contempt, such casual cruelty. It showed that while she had been grieving for him, losing sleep over him, reorganizing her entire life to care for him, he had been mocking her vulnerability, treating her love as a character flaw to be exploited. When confronted with undeniable evidence, narcissistic individuals often employ a predictable sequence of defensive maneuvers that psychologists call DAVO: deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. First they deny everything despite the evidence, then they attack the person who discovered the truth, and finally they flip the script entirely, claiming that they are actually the victim in the situation, and Javier performed this sequence almost textbook perfectly. Maria confronted him on a Thursday evening. She laid out all the evidence on their dining table, the investigation report, the photographs, the text messages, the proof that he had never been to a single legitimate oncology appointment, and for a moment, just a brief moment, she saw something flicker across his face, maybe shame, maybe fear of consequences, but it disappeared so quickly she might have imagined it, and then his face hardened and he began his defensive performance. First he claimed the evidence was fabricated, that Maria had manufactured it because she was jealous and controlling. Then when that clearly wasn't working, he attacked her character, told her she had been a terrible wife, cold, unsupportive, that he had felt lonely in their marriage for years, that she had driven him to seek comfort elsewhere, and finally, in a move that would have been laughable if it weren't so psychologically violent, he claimed that he was the real victim, that the pressure of her expectations had forced him to invent the illness because he was too afraid of disappointing her to simply ask for a divorce. Patricia, another woman whose story intersects with this pattern, described something similar. Her husband had faked a heart condition, complete with emergency room visits and prescription medications, and when she discovered the truth, he told her that her anxiety about his health had been so overwhelming that he felt he had no choice but to maintain the fiction, essentially blaming her for the elaborate deception he had created. He said, "You made me do this, you couldn't just let me be," and she remembers standing in their kitchen, hearing these words, and feeling as if reality itself had become unmoored, as if the basic rules of cause and effect no longer applied, because how do you respond to someone who claims that your love and concern forced them to gaslight you for months? The neurological impact of this kind of betrayal is profound and measurable. When you discover that someone you love has been systematically deceiving you, especially about something as serious as terminal illness, your brain experiences what researchers call betrayal trauma. This is different from other types of trauma because it involves not just a threatening event but a fundamental violation of attachment bonds. The hippocampus, your memory center, becomes hyperactive, constantly reviewing past events, trying to separate true memories from contaminated ones, trying to figure out what was real and what was performance. Meanwhile, your amygdala remains in a state of high alert, making it difficult to feel safe anywhere. Because if you couldn't trust your judgment about the person closest to you, how can you trust your judgment about anything? Maria told me that for months after the discovery, she would wake up in the middle of the night with her heart racing, her body flooded with adrenaline, not because she was having nightmares about Javier leaving, but because her brain kept replaying moments from their marriage, ordinary moments, dinner conversations, lazy Sunday mornings, intimate moments, and now she couldn't tell which of those moments had been genuine and which had been part of the performance. Her sense of her own history had become fragmented and unreliable, and this, she said, was almost worse than the betrayal itself, the feeling that her own memories, her own past, had been colonized by his deception, that she no longer owned the story of her own life. The divorce proceedings revealed even more calculation. Javier had indeed consulted attorneys extensively before implementing his cancer plan. He had moved assets, created documentation that would protect his financial interests. He had essentially been conducting a parallel legal process while Maria believed they were facing his death together, and his attorney, in court documents, actually tried to argue that Maria's emotional instability during Javier's health crisis demonstrated that she was unfit to make clear decisions about asset division. They tried to use her grief, her completely appropriate response to what she believed was her husband dying, as evidence of incompetence. But something interesting happens when a woman who has been profoundly betrayed begins to move through her initial shock and pain toward anger and clarity. Something in the nervous system starts to shift. The trauma response, which initially causes fragmentation and helplessness, can evolve into what researchers call post-traumatic growth. This isn't about silver linings or finding gratitude for suffering. It's about the way that having your reality completely shattered sometimes allows you to rebuild it according to your own design rather than inherited patterns. And for Maria, this shift began the day she stood up in court and told her story. She had been quiet through most of the proceedings, letting her attorney speak, following advice to remain composed and unemotional. But then Javier's attorney made a comment about how Maria had always been overly dramatic about health issues, and something in her, some core of self-respect that had been buried under years of accommodating and adapting, suddenly surfaced, and she stood up, her voice clear and steady, and she said, "I want to say something," and the judge, perhaps recognizing that this woman had earned the right to speak, nodded permission. Maria spoke for maybe 5 minutes. She didn't yell, didn't become hysterical, she simply told the truth in clear, declarative sentences. She described how Javier had invented a terminal illness, how he had allowed her to grieve, to rearrange her life, to suffer the anticipatory loss of someone she loved. She described finding the evidence, the messages mocking her trust, the elaborate planning of his escape, and she said, looking directly at Javier, "What you did wasn't just about ending our marriage. You could have asked for a divorce, that would have hurt, but I would have survived it with my dignity intact. Instead you chose to torture me, to make me watch you pretend to die, and the cruelty of that choice tells me everything I need to know about who you really are." And in that moment, saying those words in that public space, something shifted in her nervous system, her vagus nerve, that crucial pathway between brain and body that regulates your sense of safety and threat, began to recalibrate. She was taking back her narrative, refusing to be cast as the crazy, overly emotional wife, insisting on being seen as what she was, someone who had survived psychological torture with remarkable grace. The judge's ruling reflected this shift. Javier's attempts to portray Maria as unstable were rejected entirely. His fabrication of illness was noted in the court record as evidence of extreme bad faith and calculated deception. The asset division favored Maria significantly, not as punishment exactly, but in recognition of the additional harm caused by the deception, and crucially, the judge made a statement for the record that this kind of behavior, using fake terminal illness as a tool for exit from marriage, represented a form of psychological abuse that courts needed to take more seriously. But legal victory, important as it was, didn't immediately heal the deeper wounds. Maria spent months in therapy, working with a specialist in complex trauma, learning to understand what had happened not just to her heart but to her entire nervous system. She learned about fawn response, The way she had spent years unconsciously managing Javier's moods and needs at the expense of her own, she learned about childhood attachment patterns, how her father's emotional unavailability had trained her to work hard for love, to believe that if she just tried hard enough, was patient enough, understanding enough, she could earn the consistent affection she craved, and she learned how Javier, with the predatory instinct of someone who has learned to identify vulnerability, had recognized and exploited these patterns. Carmen, whose husband had also fabricated serious illness to exit their marriage, told me something that I think captures the essence of this particular healing journey. She said, "For a long time I thought the hardest part was accepting that he never really loved me, but eventually I realized that wasn't quite right. He probably did love me in whatever limited way he was capable of loving anyone. The real work was accepting that his limited capacity for love had nothing to do with my worth. That I had been trying to earn something from someone who simply didn't have it to give, and that my tireless efforts, my patience, my understanding, all the qualities I thought of as virtues, had actually kept me trapped in a situation that was never going to nourish me." The journey back to trust, both self-trust and trust in others, is not linear. Maria described it as having good days and terrible days. Sometimes within the same hour, she would feel strong and clear, grateful even for the hard lesson learned, and then she would see a couple holding hands in a coffee shop and suddenly be overwhelmed with grief and rage, her body remembering the tenderness she had extended to someone who was actively betraying her. She would have moments of doubting her own judgment so severely that she couldn't make simple decisions, and other moments of such clarity about her own worth that she felt invincible. And all of this, her therapist assured her, was completely normal, was in fact the messy, non-linear process of integrating a trauma that had shattered her sense of reality. One of the practices that helped Maria most was something her therapist called memory reconsolidation. She would take a specific memory from her marriage, one that had felt loving and safe, and she would allow herself to hold two truths about it simultaneously. Yes, she had felt loved in that moment. Her feelings were real and valid, and also yes, Javier was already planning his exit, was perhaps already involved with Veronica. These two truths could coexist, and holding them both allowed her to reclaim her own emotional experience as real and valid even though the relationship itself had been built on deception. It wasn't that her feelings had been stupid or wrong, it was that they had been directed toward someone who was performing rather than being genuine, and that distinction mattered enormously. Isabella's story offers another angle on recovery and reclamation. After discovering her husband's fabricated brain tumor and his affair, she did something unexpected. She went back to school. She had always wanted to study psychology but had set aside her educational goals when they married because he had claimed to need her support while he built his career, and now, at 43, she enrolled in a graduate program. She said, "I realized that I had spent 20 years making myself smaller to accommodate someone who saw my flexibility as weakness to exploit, and I decided that the best revenge wasn't anger or bitterness, it was becoming fully myself, taking up all the space I was meant to occupy, pursuing goals that had nothing to do with making someone else comfortable." The concept of betrayal as catalyst is uncomfortable because it seems to suggest that trauma can be productive, that being hurt can somehow be good, and that's not quite right. The trauma itself is never good. The deception, the cruelty, the months of unnecessary suffering, none of that needed to happen. None of it was justified or served any higher purpose. But once it has happened, once you are standing in the wreckage of what you thought your life was, you do have a choice about what you build from the rubble, and many women, once they move through the initial devastation, find that they build something more authentic and more aligned with their true values than what they had before. Maria eventually started a support group for women who had experienced similar betrayals, elaborate deceptions in intimate relationships, and she was surprised by how many women showed up, women of all ages and backgrounds, each with a story of trust weaponized against them, and what they found in sharing their stories was not just commiseration but collective wisdom. They learned to recognize the patterns, the red flags they had ignored, not to blame themselves but to sharpen their discernment. For the future, they learned to distinguish between the healthy vulnerability that real intimacy requires and the reflexive self-abandonment that trauma responses can produce, and they learned, slowly and imperfectly, to trust themselves again. The neuroscience of healing from betrayal trauma is increasingly well understood. The brain is remarkably plastic, meaning it can form new neural pathways even after significant trauma, when you engage in practices that create safety and connection, therapy, supportive friendships, creative expression, physical movement. Your nervous system gradually learns to come out of survival mode, the amygdala calms, the prefrontal cortex comes back online, you regain access to nuanced thinking rather than just threat detection. Your hippocampus stops obsessively reviewing the past and becomes able to imagine a different future, and perhaps most crucially, your vagus nerve, that communication highway between body and brain, begins to send signals of safety rather than constant danger. You start to feel at home in your body again rather than trapped in a perpetual state of high alert. For Maria, the moment she knew she was genuinely healing came almost 2 years after the divorce was finalized. She was at a park, reading a book, and a couple walked by arguing, and she noticed that her body didn't tense, her heart rate didn't increase, she didn't feel compelled to monitor or manage the situation. She simply observed and returned to her book, and later that evening she realized that for the entire day she hadn't thought about Javier at all, not with anger, not with longing, not with anything. He had simply become a person who used to be in her life, someone who had taught her painful but important lessons, but who no longer had any claim on her emotional energy, and that neutral indifference, she realized, was freedom. The question of how someone becomes capable of such elaborate cruelty is one that haunted Maria for a long time. She would ask herself what she had missed, whether there had been signs earlier in the relationship, whether she had been naive or willfully blind, and her therapist helped her understand that while there probably were signs, subtle ones, they weren't necessarily things she could have recognized without the benefit of hindsight. People who operate with this level of manipulation are often skilled at presenting exactly the image others want to see. They study what you value and perform those values convincingly. Javier had known that Maria valued loyalty and family and commitment, so he had performed those values beautifully, until he didn't need to anymore. Research into psychopathy and narcissistic personality structures reveals that for a small percentage of the population, empathy is not an automatic response but a cognitive choice. They can mimic empathy when it serves their purposes, they can perform care and concern convincingly, but they don't feel the internal discomfort that most people feel when they cause suffering. Their mirror neurons don't fire the same way. They can watch someone they supposedly love suffer and feel primarily inconvenience or irritation rather than compassion, and this isn't something you can fix or heal through love or patience. It's a fundamental difference in how they experience the world, and recognizing this, truly accepting it, is crucial to healing, because it means the failure wasn't yours. You couldn't have loved him better or been more understanding. The capacity for genuine reciprocal love simply wasn't there to begin with. Patricia told me about a conversation she had with a psychiatrist after her husband's deception was revealed. She asked if her husband might have some diagnosable condition, some explanation for what he had done, and the psychiatrist said something that shifted her entire understanding. He said whether or not he meets criteria for a specific diagnosis is actually less important than this question. Does the person demonstrate capacity and willingness to take responsibility for harm they've caused, to feel genuine remorse, to make meaningful changes? Because you can have someone with significant personality pathology who does possess those capacities, and you can have someone with no diagnosis at all who lacks them completely, and it's the latter that tells you whether healing and rebuilding is possible. And in Patricia's case, as in Maria's, the answer was clear. There was no remorse, no real accountability, only various levels of justification and blame shifting, which meant that trying to salvage the relationship would have been an exercise in self-destruction. The cultural conversation around these extreme betrayals is slowly beginning to shift. For a long time, women who stayed in relationships despite red flags were blamed for their own victimization, blamed for being too trusting, too naive, too needy. But trauma-informed psychology has helped us understand that manipulation works precisely because skilled manipulators are good at what they do. They identify vulnerabilities, often vulnerabilities created by earlier trauma, and they exploit them. Systematically, blaming the victim for being manipulated is like blaming someone for catching a virus from a person who deliberately coughed in their face. Maria wrote about her experience eventually, an essay that went viral and reached hundreds of thousands of women, many of whom reached out to share their own stories of betrayal and manipulation. And what struck her most in reading these messages was the profound isolation so many women felt, the belief that they were uniquely stupid or broken for not having seen through the deception sooner, and she realized that part of healing wasn't just individual therapy and personal growth, it was collective witnessing. It was women telling their stories publicly and saying this happened to me, and it wasn't because I was weak or foolish, it was because someone chose to be cruel, and I survived it, and you can too. And that collective testimony, that refusal to carry shame for someone else's choices, was itself a form of revolution. The relationship Maria has built with herself in the aftermath is fundamentally different from the self-concept she carried before. She describes it as having met herself, really met herself. For the first time in her 40s, she discovered that she's actually quite funny, something she had tamped down because Javier found her humor annoying. She discovered that she loves solitude, really cherishes it, something she had interpreted as failure during the marriage when Javier complained she wasn't social enough. She discovered capacity for anger, which she had been taught was unladylike and had spent decades suppressing, and she discovered that anger, when it's not turned inward as shame or outward as bitterness but instead channeled as clear boundary setting and self-advocacy, is actually a profoundly healthy emotion. Carmen started dating again about 3 years after her divorce, cautiously, with a lot of therapy and a lot of self-reflection informing her choices, and she told me about a moment on a third date with someone new when he told her a story about helping a friend through cancer treatment, and she felt her body tense, felt all the old trauma responses activate, but then she noticed something. She was able to observe her response rather than being completely swallowed by it. She could feel the fear and also feel the ground beneath her feet, could notice her rapid heartbeat and also take slow breaths to regulate it. And after the date she was able to think clearly about whether his story had triggered her because it was a red flag or because it was simply touching old wounds, and having that capacity for self-observation and discernment, that felt like a superpower. The conversation around faking serious illness to exit relationships has become more visible in recent years, largely because of social media and women's willingness to share their stories, and some interesting patterns have emerged. It's almost always men faking illness to leave women rather than the reverse. The deception almost always involves another romantic partner waiting in the wings, and the fake illness is specifically chosen to elicit maximum caretaking and minimum questioning. Cancer, brain tumors, heart conditions, serious diagnoses that explain fatigue, mood changes, decreased intimacy, all the things that might naturally occur when someone is planning to leave a relationship. The legal system is slowly catching up. Several jurisdictions have begun to recognize fraud by false pretense in intimate relationships as grounds not just for divorce but for additional damages. Courts are starting to acknowledge that while you can't legislate love or mandate attraction, you can hold people accountable for deliberate, sustained psychological torture, and that's what these fake illness deceptions amount to. They're not just about lying, they're about weaponizing a partner's love and fear to make them complicit in their own abandonment. Maria has a new relationship now, someone she met through mutual friends, someone who knows her whole story and has been patient with her healing process, and she told me about a moment early in their relationship when he had a legitimate health scare, some concerning test results that required follow-up, and she felt her entire nervous system go into red alert, felt herself starting to spiral into hypervigilance and caretaking mode. But this time she was able to pause, to notice what was happening in her body, to distinguish between past trauma and present reality, and she was able to say to him, "I need you to know that I care deeply about your health, and I'm also realizing that I have some trauma around partners and illness, so I might need some extra reassurance and transparency as we navigate this." And his response, immediate and without defensiveness, was of course, "Tell me what you need. Let's figure this out together." And that moment of being able to be vulnerable about her vulnerability, and having it met with respect rather than exploitation, felt like evidence that she had genuinely healed, Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to allow real love in. The inner child work that Maria did in therapy was particularly powerful. She realized that her pattern of overfunctioning for unavailable partners went back to her childhood, to a father who was physically present but emotionally distant, a man who never quite seemed satisfied, who always needed just a bit more from her before she could earn his approval, and as a child she had internalized the belief that love was something you had to work for, that if someone wasn't giving you affection or attention it meant you weren't trying hard enough, and this belief had followed her into adulthood, had made her the perfect target for someone like Javier, who had learned that he could demand infinite patience, infinite understanding, infinite sacrifice. And Maria would provide it all while believing she was demonstrating love when actually she was demonstrating fear, fear that if she stopped performing she would be abandoned. In therapy, Maria learned to identify the moment when she would leave herself to take care of someone else's emotional state, that subtle internal abandonment that happens so quickly you might not even notice it. You're having a feeling, maybe anger or hurt or disappointment, and then you notice the other person's discomfort with your feeling, and almost instantly, unconsciously, you shift into managing their discomfort rather than honoring your own experience, and for Maria, learning to catch that moment, to pause and say wait, I matter too, my feeling is valid too, was revolutionary. It meant she no longer needed another person to validate her worth, she could grant that validation to herself. Isabella, reflecting on her journey several years out from her divorce, said something that captures the paradox at the heart of healing from this kind of betrayal. She said, I wish it had never happened, I genuinely do. The pain was excruciating and unnecessary and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. But I also can't imagine going back to who I was before, to that version of myself who was so disconnected from her own needs and desires, who was so busy being good and selfless that she had no idea who she actually was. And so I live in this strange space of wishing the trauma hadn't happened while also being grateful for who I've become because of how I chose to heal from it. And I don't think those two truths cancel each other out, I think they're both real, and learning to hold both is part of what it means to be human. The community that formed around Maria's support group has become a kind of chosen family, women who understand each other's triggers and wounds in ways that others can't, who can laugh together about the absurdity of having survived something that shouldn't have been survivable, who celebrate each other's victories and hold space for each other's setbacks, and this collective healing, this witnessing and being witnessed, has been as powerful as any individual therapy, because betrayal trauma makes you feel crazy and alone, makes you doubt your own perception and judgment, and being in community with others who have similar stories reminds you that you're not crazy, that your reactions are normal responses to abnormal cruelty, that survival itself is an act of courage. The final court date, when the divorce was officially finalized, was surprisingly emotional for Maria, not because she had any remaining love for Javier, but because it marked the formal end of a chapter, the death of the future she had imagined, and even when that future was based on illusion, grieving its loss was necessary and real. She allowed herself to cry in the courthouse bathroom, allowed herself to feel the full weight of all she had lost, not just the relationship but the innocence. The easy trust she once had, the belief that love alone could protect you from harm, and then she washed her face, reapplied her lipstick, and walked out into the bright afternoon feeling lighter than she had in years, feeling like she had finally set down a burden she was never meant to carry in the first place. What happens to people like Javier, the ones who orchestrate these elaborate cruelties, is a question Maria stopped asking after a while. She heard through mutual acquaintances that his relationship with Veronica hadn't lasted long after the divorce was finalized, that he had apparently repeated similar patterns with her, that he was now involved with someone else and the cycle was continuing, and Maria realized she didn't need to know, didn't need to track his life or hope for his comeuppance. Because his life, his choices, his patterns, were no longer her concern. She had extracted the lessons she needed, had done the healing work, and the rest was simply not her story anymore. The transformation from victim to survivor to thriver is not a straight line, it's a spiral. You circle back around to familiar pain but at a higher level of understanding each time. Maria still has moments when she feels the old anger rise, when she wants the world to know what Javier did, wants him to face some cosmic accountability, And then she remembers that carrying that desire is like drinking poison and expecting him to get sick, so she practices letting go again and again, not because he deserves her forgiveness but because she deserves her peace, and that distinction matters. Forgiveness is not something she owes him, but peace is something she owes herself. The wisdom that emerges from surviving this level of betrayal is hard-won and precious. It's not the kind of wisdom you can learn from books or well-meaning advice. It's wisdom written into your nervous system, earned through the actual experience of shattering and slowly, painstakingly, putting yourself back together. And that wisdom says that you are more resilient than you knew, that your capacity for love, even after it's been exploited, is not a weakness but a strength, that trusting again is possible, but it requires trusting yourself first, and that some people will meet your vulnerability with respect while others will see it as opportunity for exploitation, and learning to tell the difference is the most important skill you can develop. Maria teaches now, gives talks at women's centers and writes a blog about recovery from intimate betrayal, and she always ends with the same message. She tells women that if they are currently in the middle of discovering a betrayal like hers, if they are standing in that first moment of shattered reality wondering how they will survive, she wants them to know that they will survive, that the pain that feels unbearable right now will gradually become bearable, not because time heals all wounds, but because they will develop new capacities, new strengths, new clarity about their own worth, and she tells them that they are not alone, that this happened not because they were broken or foolish but because someone chose cruelty, and that choice, that cruelty, says everything about the person who did it and nothing about their inherent worthiness of love. Years from now, Maria knows she will tell this story differently. The sharp edges will soften, some details will fade while others will become almost mythic in their clarity, and that's okay. That's how memory works, how trauma becomes integrated into the larger narrative of a life. It stops being the defining story and becomes one story among many, important but not consuming, painful but no longer debilitating, and she will be able to say without hesitation that she is genuinely happy, not happy it happened, never that, but happy with who she has become, happy with the life she has built from the ruins, happy with the fierce self-love and clear boundaries that now guide her choices, happy with her capacity to help others navigate similar darkness, happy in a way that doesn't require perfect circumstances or someone else's validation, happy in the deep, quiet way that comes from truly knowing yourself and deciding that who you are is enough, more than enough, exactly right.